Okay, everybody hearing us okay? Give us a little thumbs up or a little heart emoji if you can hear us streaming. We'll let people trickle in. I know this is a hot topic we got ourselves covering today. Exciting new feature coming out of THORChain with an integration in Edge. And Eridanus hearing us okay? I know he was.
Yes, sir. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Cool, cool. And so,
Great.
all right. So a little, not really a recap, but a little overview of what we'll be covering today. An exciting couple features. One that's been around inside of THORChain for a while, which is the DEX Aggregator and how that works, what it delivers. Actually, you know something? I actually don't know how long it's been around for. Tyler, Eridanus, what's kind of its quick history on the DEX Aggregator? When did that launch?
That launched, I believe, around 6 months ago.
6 months ago. Okay, cool.
Um, yeah, relatively new still.
Relatively new, but it is now live inside of Edge. So within Edge, people can, just right through the swap interface when you want to go trade one crypto to another. Edge will hunt through, over half a dozen different exchange partners now, including THORChain and including the DEX aggregator, in order to be able to find the supported assets. And I think the key with the DEX aggregator is really being able to support assets that you're just not going to get support for through either THORChain itself or some of these other more centralized swap exchanges. Well, let's see here. We can go right into it. It looks like we got a good amount of people chiming in. We can cover DEX aggregator first. I know the hot topic is savers. What people want to know how people can earn yield with like a single asset, Bitcoin, Litecoin, and whatnot, without the risk of impermanent loss. But what are the risks? And I think that's a key thing we're going to cover and be honest with people is that, there actually is some risk, but what is that risk? Is it within your risk appetite? How does it compare to CeFi, which obviously huge risk in CeFi? But let's talk about the DEX aggregator really quick. When you guys cover what exactly is this feature of DEX aggregator and how does it augment THORChain?
Yeah, FamiliarCow, do you want?
Yeah, so DEX aggregation is this pretty exciting concept of so we all know that there's all these DEXs that live in crypto land. There's Uniswap, THORChain, and then there's ones on Avalanche, and all these DEXs have their own liquidity, and they have really, really great liquidity on these long tail assets, ones that just aren't present on other DEXs. And so like obviously something like Trader Joe has really great Avalanche liquidity. Uniswap has amazing Ethereum liquidity. And what THORChain can do is it can make a smart contract call to use these other DEXs. So let's say you have Bitcoin and you want to swap to a pangolin token on Avalanche. So you have Bitcoin, and what you can do is you can send that Bitcoin to THORChain and instruct it to, hey, take this Bitcoin, switch it to AVAX, and then once you have that AVAX, take it to Pangolin and then switch it to their native token. So you can do this all with just one transaction, and it's super easy and great for user convenience, and it kind of replaces the need for that centralized exchange that you might otherwise need to use to deposit into your account, that centralized exchange, and then get the other asset out that you need. So it just basically chains together all these DEXs to make it easy to swap the short tail asset from it can go either way. So you could start on that long tail asset and go through the DEX and then end out on native Bitcoin. It settles to native Bitcoin or Litecoin or any other asset. Or you can go the other way where you start out on that on Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, or any supported THORChain asset, and then go through to another DEX. Or you could even do it on both ends, where you start out in a long tail asset, it goes through a DEX, then it goes through THORChain in the middle, and then it goes out through another DEX aggregator on the other end to another long tail coin. So there's a lot of applications, and it's mostly moving across multiple chains to low liquidity tokens that are only really present on other DEXs. So it's a really big user convenience step and makes it very simple to basically use DEXs without having to interact with all the dApps and you can just do it right from Edge Wallet.
Wow, and I remember when I heard about this feature, I was like, wait, how does this work? And you can do this in one transaction. I thought this is the kind of thing that at Edge, we're all about like taking the multi-step process and turning it into one step. A lot of times, at Edge, we have to do the hard work and chain transactions together, use a backend that pre-signs transactions and whatnot. But this is all happening entirely at the protocol level. And that's kind of what blew my mind. What are And one thing I wanted to mention too is for a lot of people, they don't realize when you use a centralized exchange, sometimes you actually have to do these steps one by one yourself manually, because a lot of assets are paired only with one other asset. So you've got some long tail asset, it's paired with ETH, and you then have Bitcoin, which is paired with USD and maybe also paired with ETH. You've got to go trade, wait for that trade to happen, and then take the outcoming asset and trade that again. And so this sometimes is, manual even in the most centralized services. So you guys have done an amazing job to pair it all together and make it a one-step process for users. What would you say is some of the limitations, and I want to call it risks, because I don't think there's, other than the protocol risks of each of the DEXs, including THORChain, that there are risks. But what are some of the user experience hurdles that people might run into? Because I want this Twitter space to be as honest as possible, right? There's a lot of great things being built, but there are hiccups and corner cases that might happen within these products. What would you say are some of those hiccups and corner cases with the DEX aggregator?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's when you're daisy chaining two transactions together, they're things can go wrong at every step, right? And so with a DEX aggregation swap, say you're swapping from Bitcoin to a long tail asset on Uniswap, the user, as you mentioned, only signs that first transaction. So that's the only transaction they need to actually sign and broadcast. And then what happens is that the network, once the Bitcoin to Ethereum swap happens, the network or the threshold signature vaults actually will sign that second transaction for the user. So they'll sign the ETH to, let's say they're swapping to Uni. So they'll sign that transaction, and it's basically a best effort. So one of the things that can happen is that if for some reason Ethereum gas spikes at that exact moment where the vault is signing that outbound, potentially that transaction will get dropped just because there's a limited amount of gas that the vaults can spend just for security reasons. And so it'll be a best effort kind of fire and forget transaction. And if that transaction fails, well, then that user will end up with the Ethereum at that same destination address. And so what happens then is that it's basically what they have to do now outside of this feature is make the Bitcoin to Ethereum swap first and then do the Ethereum to Uniswap second. So that's kind of one of the risks, I would say, or kind of user experience hurdles. And we're kind of constantly tweaking the amount of gas that these vaults can spend, especially in these situations. And so over time, we should get this to be a more smooth experience. The other thing that can kind of happen is that for Bitcoin or other UTXO inbound swaps specifically, there are inbound confirmation counts, right? So that's another security feature of THORChain where THORChain will wait, say someone's swapping one Bitcoin to Uni using this feature. THORChain will actually wait one Bitcoin block before it executes the swap, just to ensure that confirmations happen. It's a valid UTXO transaction, and in that 10 minutes, there could be price movements in the Bitcoin ETH pool in THORChain. There could be price movements in the ETH Uni pool on Uniswap. The user does provide a limit, a outbound limit, so that gets passed all the way through to that final swap. But in that 10 minutes, it's very possible that that limit cannot be met. And again, that user would end up with ETH on their Ethereum address. And then finally, if it's a large swap, and one Bitcoin is a pretty large swap, there's also an outbound delay in the THORChain protocol, which again is another blanket security measure that we implemented. And that outbound delay could delay the transaction up to an hour, depending on the activity happening on THORChain. So if there's a lot of volume coming through THORChain, that will be delayed up to an hour. And again, the same thing can happen. Pool prices can move, gas prices can spike, and that transaction could potentially fail, and the user could end up with Ethereum, which is it is kind of a bummer in terms of the user experience, but they still have their Ethereum and they can go swap to Uni, using Uniswap directly. So I'd say that's kind of the large risk that in terms of user experience. Early on in this feature, we did have some dropped transactions where there was a few asset matching bugs because there's a lot of information that you need to put in the memo. You need to put in the destination DEX aggregator that you're going for. So you want to indicate that you want to swap on Uniswap. You want to indicate the destination token. You want to indicate the outbound amount. And there were a few times early on in this feature where transactions were dropped just based on all this logic that we needed to add. Of course, the treasury refunded, and those issues were patched. But again, as we kind of continue on, we're going to continue to tweak this feature. And right now, the largest, I would say, risk is just on the user experience side.
So in a way, the biggest risk is that the user would have to do what they would normally have to do if the DEX aggregator didn't exist. Yeah, so in a way, not too bad. I'm going to pause it real quick just to mention that, hey, we've got a few people here listening in. We'll cover quite a few topics. Feel free to go ahead, and if anyone has any questions about what we're talking about, we'll keep this as an open forum. Feel free to raise hand. And I think we've got both Edge and the THORChain channel hosting, so they can kind of put people up on stage to ask your questions. And also, we never quite did any introductions. So Eridanus, give us a little, and Tyler as well, give us a little intro on who you are, what you guys do, and as well, your contribution to the THORChain ecosystem. I know you guys work with 9 Realms. What is kind of 9 Realms versus THORChain, and how do the two organizations work well together?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I can speak to 9 Realms for a second. So 9 Realms, we kind of make up some of the core contributors to the THORChain protocol. We support the network in many different ways through a security team that we put together called THORSec. We run infrastructure for THORChain. We run full nodes. So if you're hitting thornode.9realms or midgard.9realms, that's our infrastructure that we provide to the ecosystem. And we also our engineers make up some of the core contributors to the THORChain protocol itself. So myself, my name is Eridanus. I'm a senior engineer for 9 Realms. My main focus is integrations at this point. So I kind of lead all of the integrations with different wallets such as Edge and Trust Wallet. And of course, all the conversations that we might have with DEXs, platforms, and even potentially centralized exchanges that might want to use cross-chain swaps, savers, down the line lending. And so I help teams integrate with THORChain and also work on the THORChain protocol itself. So that's me.
Yeah, I'm FamiliarCow. I'm the communications director at 9 Realms, and I just help 9 Realms with everything that they're doing. So obviously 9 Realms is very critical to THORChain as a whole. So we're just here to contribute as much as we can to THORChain, just make this the best decentralized, full stack cross-chain DeFi protocol that it could possibly be.
Very cool. Awesome. And for those unfamiliar with us over at Edge, I'm CEO and co-founder, Paul Puey, CEO and co-founder of Edge, and we're self-custody exchange wallet application, lets people buy, sell, and trade, goes through multiple different exchange partners, and in a way, DEXs are some of our highest priority for integration because we do fundamentally believe in the additional level of autonomy and censorship resistance that DEXs provide. While we do support some centralized services, especially for fiat on and off ramps, DEXs and also DeFi integration is key to what we're doing, letting people do not just buying and selling and trading, but being able to earn yield, which is an exciting piece that THORChain's really augmenting into our app, and then also borrowing. And that's coming up through some other protocols, although I know that that's an upcoming feature directly inside of THORChain, allowing people to borrow in the protocol, not having an outside smart contract on like an EVM chain. So that's kind of our focus. One of the mottos we have is we want to take CeFi and burn it to the ground and make sure we can replace CeFi entirely with self-custody solutions and avoid the next contagion and the next like BlockFi Celsius, Genesis debacles. That's where we're at. Cool. I think the DEX aggregator, amazing feature. It's live now. It's been live for quite some time. I'm not sure if people have any questions about it. I think it's relatively straightforward, although complex underneath the hood. It's definitely not one of the simpler things to implement. So hats off to the team at 9 Realms and THORChain to get that up and running and live.
So you guys are using THORSwap's DEX aggregator, correct? So
we're using their
team...
smart. Yeah, it's their API and their smart contract that kind of proxies into THORChain. Actually, Eridanus might be able to explain more about like who runs what within the ecosystem, like what are the options within the DEX aggregator, because it's still a THORChain product and it's baked into the protocol, but then these aggregators are actually kind of outside contracts, correct me if I'm wrong, on each of the separate chains that can be run by different entities.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit of an interesting setup, but yeah, the DEX aggregator feature itself sits, at the protocol level. The THORChain Thor node image, the source code, that's what executes these contract calls. But there is what's called these DEX aggregator contracts that need to be built, and those are built by external teams. So THORSwap has built a lot of them for Ethereum and Avalanche DEXs. The team over at Rango as well have built some, and as well as XDeFi, I believe. And I'm sure we'll continue to see more and more teams build these DEX aggregator contracts. They're pretty boilerplate smart contracts, where the logic changes is generally around like fee skimming that each of these projects do, depending on their policy around that. But they're pretty boilerplate smart contracts that you can basically replicate what other teams have done, and they're pretty simple. There's basically two types of DEX aggregation. There's swap in and swap out, as FamiliarCow was mentioning. So you're either swapping in from a long tail ETH to like Uni to Bitcoin, or you're swapping out from Bitcoin to a long tail asset on ETH or Avalanche, and you can obviously pair those two together. So those DEX aggregator contracts basically have those two functions: swap in and swap out. And then those teams submit the DEX aggregator contracts to be whitelisted in the Thor node code itself. So each of them must be whitelisted, for security reasons. And the team basically, THORSec and the internal devs will basically just review and make sure that the contracts have the basic security principles that the contracts should have and execute the function properly, and they'll get whitelisted and be able to be used. And then I know THORSwap, they have a whole layer on their API, which makes things easy in terms of their router API allows you, will return multiple routes and give you kind of the best pricing across all the routes, and does a lot of like transaction tracking and gas management for you as well. So there's a whole layer on top of THORChain that these other external teams are offering.
Yeah, we definitely experienced that with the integration of the DEX aggregator. The API from THORSwap was pretty key to make that integration as easy as possible. I think THORChain in and of itself has easily, of all of the different protocols, kind of developer UX in mind. It definitely is that baked in. And any of the challenges we ran into in integration are very solvable, as opposed to, oh, great, this is going to require a whole overhaul. No, it's just like, we just have to add this API endpoint. We have to add this node endpoint, and things become much easier over time. So I think you guys are on the right track, just starting from bare bones, we can get it working, but with this path forward. So it was very exciting. And even if it obviously doesn't benefit Edge, anyone listening that is working on a project that could benefit from THORChain, I couldn't give them enough props. They've been a great team to work with. Eridanus specifically has helped us a lot with integration. Most responsive, knowledgeable, and great to work with team. So definitely, I encourage even the competitors of Edge to work with THORChain. I think it's a path forward that we want to see in the industry.
And the whole point of THORChain is to be that decentralized infrastructure. It's to build that base layer that other people can, like yourselves, like other wallets can use for their own products. Because the whole goal of this is to bring that decentralized infrastructure to the users in a way that's familiar to them, easy for them to use, doesn't require a lot of experience and learning how to connect to all these different apps on these DEXs and figure out how to make a swap. They can just see they have this coin, say, hey, I want that coin instead, and then the wallet just does it for them. And it's just that simple. So THORChain is just there to be that base layer infrastructure. And it connects to all these chains that there's no other infrastructure that connects to the chains that THORChain does. I mean, just THORChain itself, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Ethereum, Avalanche, Dogecoin, Atom. It's pretty incredible what it connects to. And then you have the aggregators going into basically the long tail of that and getting all of the coins that are on those networks like Avalanche, like Ethereum. Obviously, I think THORSwap API has Kyber Swap, 1inch, and Uniswap. All integrated directly into there, all searching for best price. So it really is it's searching every decentralized route. It's searching an unlimited pool, given enough time, right? There would be so many of these DEX is integrated in, that it'll just find the best route through all the possible decentralized routes and just guarantee the user the best price and best execution. So that's
Yeah.
the end goal, and it makes it easy for wallets to integrate and just offer that as a service to users.
Yep, love it, especially that it's one step to the user, or we call it one sitting, right? You might have to click a few buttons, choose how much you want to swap, but it's all about one sitting versus sit down, do something, wait, come back to it. And so the one sitting experience is what we love. Well, cool. I think we covered the DEX aggregator pretty well. It's an awesome feature. It's live today. Definitely give it a try. Send us your feedback. Let us know how we can improve the experience. But hot topic, savers. Should we dive into it? I know that we posted a few tweets, both the THORChain team as well as Edge and myself posted about savers being live in Edge. And fundamentally, I think this is like half of the product that a lot of CeFi companies have been banking on. Let's talk about the two that have kind of gone belly up, BlockFi and Celsius. Two products made them really popular. Probably half or more than half of that is earning yield. I personally am not one that really cares to earn a whole lot to earn yield on my crypto, but so many people do, right? And I think I could see that, especially if you have a whole bunch of crypto. Even if you put a little bit of that in earning of yield, what you earn from that can be pretty significant. Like it can be, heck, it could be your annual salary, right? So there's a huge amount of interest in this. The flip side of that is also borrowing. So that is another feature that's coming to THORChain in the future. But on the earning of yield, savers, key innovation is that it's single-sided, meaning I just deposit one asset, I'm exposed to that one asset, I earn yield in that one asset. Let's talk about where probably the biggest question that I got on Twitter, which is where does the yield come from? There's this interesting meme. It's like, if you don't know where the real yield comes from, you are the yield, right? And that was kind of the case with a lot of the kind of what you call pyramid schemes in a way that some of these centralized services were. You guys want to kick off with a quick description, high level description of where does this yield come from in savers? Where are people getting it? Who's paying this money?
Yeah, let me say first that I'm so glad that people are actually asking where the yield is coming from and not just saying like, oh, great. Like these guys, wow, I could just put in all my Bitcoins into here and I'll just make more Bitcoins. That's amazing. So the fact that people are actually asking where the yield is coming from, showing that, people are actually learning a bit maybe from some of these like big disasters that have been happening. So the way that THORChain does things is completely differently from obviously like a centralized service who lends out coins and then you don't know what they do with your coins once they have them. It's a black box basically. So THORChain is comprised of a bunch of liquidity pools, and when people make swaps, the coins go into that one pool. So someone swaps Bitcoin for Litecoin, they put in Bitcoin into the Bitcoin pool. There's a rune in both of those pools, so the rune gets swapped around, and then that user gets out Litecoin from the Litecoin pool. So in that case, a little bit of fees gets given to that liquidity pool and stays in that pool. So the savers feature is essentially a way to provide yield single-sided to that liquidity pool, and you earn a portion of those fees when people swap. So you don't have any risk of impermanent loss because a regular liquidity provider takes on that risk in exchange for a slightly higher yield. A person that's only in savers only earns about half the yield of a regular liquidity provider on THORChain that's providing both Rune and the asset like Bitcoin. But the new savers vault is this risk averse way of providing liquidity into THORChain without impermanent loss. So it's basically replacing the need for that decentralized service where you don't know what they're doing with your coins. Now you know what's happening with your coins. It's in the liquidity pools and backed by the liquidity in the pool itself. So all the yield just comes from swaps and also just regular block rewards on THORChain. Basically, where the yield comes from for a regular liquidity provider on any AMM.
Yeah, I want to just like touch on the block rewards a little bit more. So the block rewards are emissions from the protocol reserve that happen every block to all of the liquidity pools and also all of the nodes, the bond providers. And these block rewards are meant to be kind of a bootstrapping mechanism for the network. I think there's an emission curve of about 8 years. And so like this protocol reserve will kind of slowly emit Rune over time. It actually emits less and less Rune over time based, the basically a curve that defines it. And this is kind of meant to be a bootstrapping yield for the liquidity pools and bootstrapping rewards for the bond providers as well. The main goal, especially for me and Nine Realms at the integrations level, is to get more integrations for wallets and get more volume coming through THORChain, so that the yield coming from wallet integrations and L1 swaps is greater than the yield coming from block rewards, and over time just replaces it completely. So that's like the long-term goal of the network. And once that happens, then we basically have a self-sustaining network that is just earning yield, providing enough yield to the users and enough yield to the node operators to continue securing the network.
And so you mentioned one thing about the amount of yield that's being generated for people in savers, and that it's half of what would be earned by a liquidity provider. Now, when you say half, is it half and such that the other half that would normally be earned gets given to the liquidity provider, so the liquidity provider is actually earning even more than their kind of base amount of yield? Like, for example, if there were only liquidity providers in the system and not savers, and say the yield were 10%. Now we introduce savers, and someone deposits savers and they would normally earn 10%, but we want to shift it over. So really they're earning 5%. Does that additional 5% go to the liquidity provider, so they're earning 15%? Is that kind of what it would look like? So they're actually earning almost like 3x what the savers would earn?
Yeah, so that extra yield does go to the dual LPers. And so it's basically, as FamiliarCow was mentioning, it's basically a trade-off of risk versus reward, right? The dual LPers will be subject to impermanent loss. They will deposit both Rune and the L1 asset. Pool prices can move between the time that they deposit and withdraw. So they might, experience impermanent loss in that regard. But they are earning 50% of the yield that is basically earned by the L1 assets deposited by the savers, in return for taking on that risk. And in turn, the savers are depositing that L1 asset. They do not have exposure to impermanent loss, and they are taking a little bit less yield based on the amount of L1 that they deposit. So it's a kind of choose your own adventure in terms of the risk profile. And those who are less risk averse should really deposit into savers, and those who can kind of are more advanced users, I would say, could benefit from still being a dual LP.
Right. And so the big question people have is like, when people interface with a lot of other DEXs and provide liquidity, it's almost always dual asset. And any time that it's a single asset, and I think I actually had a criticism on Twitter about this. Someone said, actually not on Twitter, I was on a group, I think in WhatsApp, and said, oh, no, I've used that feature before. I got screwed because Rune price dropped. And, I got impermanent loss. Well, I go, oh, wait a minute. Were you using savers? Because savers has only been out for, what is it, a month or so?
Yeah, just about
roughly,
a month.
Or about a month. And it sounded like he had done this quite a while ago. And so, to my understanding, he had done a feature. I believe this is a feature in THORChain where you can be a regular LPer with dual asset, but you deposit one asset and it automatically splits it into two. It swaps half of it into Rune if you had deposited Bitcoin or vice versa. Correct. Yep. But then you're still a dual asset depositor at that point. And so that's what I think most of the ecosystem is used to, is that, hey, when I deposit one asset, it's just getting split and I really am incurring exposure to two assets. And how is Savers able to accomplish true, exposure only to a single asset? That's probably a big question for people, which obviously, helps with the impermanent loss.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can talk about the fundamental mechanic of savers, which is called synthetic assets. And so just a little bit of history. Obviously, when THORChain first started, there was just the dual-sided LPs where you would have L1 asset and Rune paired. And THORChain depends on arbitrage bots to keep the prices in line with external markets. And sometimes arbitraging with just L1 blockchains can be very slow. As we mentioned before, for Bitcoin, for example, there can be up to a 10-minute confirmation inbound time that the network kind of enforces, or even longer. Sometimes Bitcoin blocks take an hour. So this is a very inefficient way to arbitrage the pools, which makes it kind of hard to keep these prices in line. So the synthetic asset is an asset that exists on the THORChain L1 blockchain. So it is a THORChain asset that is backed 50%, basically by the liquidity units of the underlying pool. So you can mint synthetic Bitcoin by swapping from any other asset. So say you have one L1 Bitcoin and you want to mint synthetic Bitcoin in order to arbitrage the Bitcoin pool, you would actually do a swap from Bitcoin to Rune, Rune to synthetic Bitcoin. So your Bitcoin gets dumped into the pool, and essentially then your synthetic Bitcoin is basically backed by 50% Bitcoin and 50% Rune, basically the liquidity units of that pool. And when you swap into a synthetic, it's actually minting that synthetic. And when you swap out of that synthetic, it's burning that synthetic. And so what happens is you are then able to use that synthetic asset to arbitrage the Bitcoin pool quicker. So, for a THORChain transaction, it costs 0.02 Rune to post it. Block times are 5 seconds, so they're super quick. And so that allows you to arbitrage all of the pools without actually having to touch the external L1, which is great for arbitrage bots, keeps the markets way more efficient. And then, so we established synthetics, we rolled that feature out, and then we moved on to savers, where we applied synthetics in order to take advantage of their efficiency and take advantage of their being backed by the liquidity units of the underlying pool. And we created these savers vaults, and the savers vaults are essentially a pool where the asset is the synthetic asset. And so when you deposit into savers, again, you're still minting a synthetic asset. So you're still swapping. So if you're depositing Bitcoin into the savers vault, you're going from L1 Bitcoin and you're swapping into synthetic Bitcoin and depositing it into the savers pool. And so that's essentially the mechanic there. And as swaps come through the native L1 pool, the protocol will determine how much yield those savers should get based on the amount of L1 Bitcoin they originally deposited, and it will mint that additional yield into synthetic Bitcoin. So it'll mint more synthetic Bitcoin to cover that yield, to basically distribute that yield to the savers of the L1 Bitcoin. And I do see Chad Barraford is up here as well, so feel free to jump in, Chad, at any point too.
Yeah, one of the biggest spokespersons for THORChain here in the spaces.
Yeah, I think what Eridanus said was pretty dead on the money. The only thing that I would add to that is that when the network determines that the savers should get let's call it 1 Bitcoin or something, like some amount of Bitcoin for the yield they produce, and it mints more synthetic Bitcoin into that pool, what's actually happening there underneath the hood from a mathematical perspective is that it's just reallocating value away from the LPs and then towards the savers, because every swap that happens, the LPs get basically 100% of that value, from in the pool in a sense. Well, technically the nodes get some of it too, but to keep the conversation simple, the LPs basically get 100% of the yield and the savers get no yield, right? So we need a methodology to kind of reallocate some of that yield that the LPs had earned and then gift it over to the savers. And basically by minting a synthetic or minting some amount of synthetic Bitcoin into the savers, you effectively are doing it. You're actually redirecting some of the value away from LPs into savers. So I don't want to give people the impression that we're just minting fake Bitcoin all day long and everything, and that makes no sense, because that kind of the way it sounds like we're just minting Bitcoin from nowhere and just and I don't want to give that impression. The reality is it's not minting from anywhere. It's just really just taking purchasing power away from the LPs and just basically giving it over to the savers. That's really what's happening mathematically.
Yeah, that's a great point, because as mentioned, the synthetic units, the synthetic Bitcoin is backed by the liquidity units. So if you mint more, you're basically saying, well, these synthetic Bitcoin holders have rights over more of that L1 pool. And as the yield comes through, it's basically there's liquidity fees to swap, and that's liquidity fees are in that native Bitcoin that are just being left in the pool. And so the minting basically will move some of that over to the synthetic Bitcoin holders.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to answer Paul's question from a moment ago about the yield of savers. He was asking if you get 10% yield for LPs and then savers come in and then I get 15% yield. That depends on the quantity of synthetics, right? So if there's only one synthetic saver, you're getting 50% of that person's. So you're going from 10% yield to probably 10.001 1. Like, it's not very much.
Mm.
But if you had, hypothetically, if the pool was 90% savers, we'll just say, and you get 10% like LPs, then those LPs are getting their 10% plus half of the 90%. So that's another 45%. So LPs are exposed to basically 55%, right, of the yield of the pool, even though they've only provided 10% of the value. Do you see what I mean? So it really
Right.
it's relational to the quantity of savers in the pool relative to the quantity of dual-sided. So the more savers there are, basically the larger percentage of the yield the LPs are taking in some sense.
That makes sense. And there's a cap to the amount of liquidity that can be in savers versus in traditional LP, correct?
Correct. Like people can, deploy capital as an LP all day long up until the hard cap, which basically is the security of the network. And then savers itself, there's a hard cap on that as well in the code base that is currently at, I think, at 30% of the pool depth. And so you can mint up until that point, and then the network won't allow any more synthetic, Bitcoin to be minted outside the context of yield for those savers. And then we can, as a community, we can increase that number. And I think the intention of the community at this point, at least, and this is to be determined, people are discussing and debating these things, and it's an active conversation, is that we'll probably go to 50% utilization, and then enable what we call the protocol and liquidity, or the POL. And at that point, it allows effectively as many savers as people want to deploy, and the POL will be the LP equivalent on the LP side to maintain that the synthetic utilization is basically kept around 50%. Even though we're adding more and more savers and more people to deploy more and more Bitcoin, the network itself will ensure that the synth utilization does not grow beyond 50% or so.
Let's talk about that 50% limit and how that affects the entire system in a bit. But we do have someone with a question here. So Maverick, you're up as a speaker. Feel free to fire off.
Oh, thanks, Paul. First, I wanted to say that I tried the THORChain integration in Edge, and it went really well. So great job, guys. Very
Thank you.
Easy experience, and everything went well. I guess my first question would be, have you guys done any, calculation estimations, or of a certain threshold of, let's say, assets like Bitcoin or Ethereum needing to come onto THORChain for there to be a kind of convergence of user experience in terms of slippage for traders or swappers, right? Do you guys have a number in mind where if we get up to this much, we attract this much Bitcoin, pull this much Bitcoin or Ethereum in swaps between Bitcoin and Ethereum, or Ethereum to Bitcoin, are, let's say, have similar pricing, similar pricing to something that someone would be used to at a Binance or a Coinbase? I was wondering how far away do you guys think you are, how close you are? I'd like to get some, if you guys have thought about that at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way we think about it is that generally we need $2 million of depth for the swaps to become, pretty equal and pretty head on versus other centralized exchanges. And for most of the pools, we're far past that. For Bitcoin, I think we have 27 million in there. I haven't looked at Ethereum recently, but 16 million in Ethereum. So for those pools, you'll be experiencing probably around 25 basis points of slippage, which is pretty on par for on Kraken or KuCoin, for example. You'll usually face a 20 basis points fee at least, and sometimes more than that. So generally, we try to have our goal, and obviously it's very dependent on external liquidity providers. But if we have $2 million and up, it's going to get pretty close to other DEXs and approaching other centralized exchanges.
That's awesome.
So one good point to make here is that there's no lower limit to how low THORChain slippage fees can go. So as the liquidity pools grow, and I'll say unequivocally, the goal is hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. It's not a couple $1 million. There eventually will be hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins in these liquidity pools secured by THORChain. And once it gets to that point and that level of liquidity, any kind of smaller swap, there will be exponentially lower fees. Right now, there's about 800 Bitcoins in THORChain, I believe, when I checked yesterday, maybe a little less than 900 at this point. And when that grows to thousands, tens of thousands, and then 100,000, more than that eventually. Fees just get lower and lower and lower, and there's no lower bound to how low that can go. It's only at that point the biggest fee is going to be your outbound transfer fee, the gas fee on the Bitcoin network, or your Ethereum gas or something like that. So as the pools grow, that just keeps shrinking. So as THORChain gets larger and larger and just gets more and more assets in it, trading fees decrease exponentially for everybody involved.
Yeah, so there's a link between THORChain's success and I guess like reduced pricing volatility across crypto, and even fees.
Yeah, for these cross-chain routes,
The way that I think about it is that at any given moment in time, there's always some quantity of swap that is cheaper to do on THORChain, and it's more expensive to do on a Binance or something like this. Like, so if you were to trade $100 million through the Bitcoin pool right now, you would get completely, screwed on fees. Like, you would get so many fees taken out, it'd be ridiculous. And so nobody would ever do that. But if you were to trade like, $100 on THORChain, it would be far cheaper to do that on THORChain than it would be to do on Binance. And so there's always like a line in the sand of like, if your trade is below this quantity, it's cheaper on THORChain. And if it's above this quantity, it's cheaper on Binance or something similar to it. And that line is just moving based upon the depth of the pool. Like, that line will go higher up the more deep it becomes, and more down the more shallow the pool becomes. And so it's like there's always a line in the sand. And the question is like, what is that line today? Is it like 1 Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin or like whatever the hell that number would be? And so like at any given moment that can be calculated of like when is that kind of separation between when is it cheaper to do on THORChain versus Binance? And then just in my opinion, like as the Rune price naturally increases over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, it's just from crypto moving and so forth and so on, that the pool depth will naturally be quite deep, and so it'll become eventuality that like for 90% of traders who aren't whales, that want to make massive trades, it'll be cheaper to do it on THORChain. And for the ones that are like, people who use OTC dealers, they'll probably continue to use OTC dealers.
And what kind of add on to that, for those people using apps like Edge or even THORSwap, THORWallet, whatnot, is that you're getting a different UX than what you're getting with a centralized exchange like Binance. Or Binance, you can specify the exact price, and if you specify that price, when it hits, you get the whatever basis points you're charging a fee. With THORChain, you're getting a kind of a consumer, I want to buy this amount and give me a quote experience. And so that quote is relatively fixed, meaning that you're not going to get below that specific amount of a destination asset. However, that comes at the trade-off in the sense that quote is going to represent a larger amount of slippage than you might actually get. Because with THORChain, there's what's called a limit that gets specified with each transaction saying, hey, I want to swap Bitcoin to ETH, but don't give me any less than this amount of ETH. Bitcoin takes at least 10 minutes to confirm on average, and the price of Bitcoin relative to ETH could change during that period of time. And so to make sure that the execution can still go through, we have to set that limit. I think in the initial implementation in Edge, we set it about 5% off. And so that could represent a really bad quote. But in the end of the day, when it actually swaps, you're very likely to get something much, much smaller than 5%. It's that guarantee that you're being given, hey, I'm not going to get any worse than this amount. Now, we can bring that kind of volatility percent down over time, and we can bring it down for assets that are much faster to confirm as well. That's the thing that we're doing in Edge in our next release. So that way, faster source assets like ETH and AVAX can have a much smaller slippage quote. But in the end of the day, that's just your quote. What you actually get is based on the slippage and the actual slippage inside of THORChain, and that's entirely based on the volume, which is what Savers is meant to help with, right? We're getting much more liquidity into the system, which creates less slippage when people trade.
Maybe a good time to also mention that there's no sandwich attacks or anything like that on THORChain or other types of MEV that you might see on something like SushiSwap or like Uniswap or something like that, where validators will change the transaction ordering to screw over users and things like that. Where this price limit wouldn't hit, it'd mostly be because of the price change of Bitcoin or Ethereum and your limit not hitting, rather than having to specify a limit. So that way, you don't get screwed over by a MEV bot or something like that on Ethereum. So it's kind of different in that way.
Yeah, and a lot of people will say that, hey, how come the fees or the total spread or slippage looks relatively high? And once again, that's part of the guarantee. We're trying to guarantee that this thing actually will execute, because it's also bad user experience when you fire off a transaction. And sure, if everything were steady state, you can get the 25 basis points, 50 basis points. But because prices change, you now get a transaction that fails, right? And you pay the mining fee of sending out your Bitcoin, but then the Bitcoin comes back to you minus other mining fees. It's just a bad user experience. And so to compensate for that, we add an extra few percentage and provide people with an honest quote, but that's kind of your worst case quote. And it likely gets better than that. So I just want to mention that to people to be aware of when you see these kind of higher quotes coming out of THORChain than some of the centralized providers. Cool. All right. Getting back to savers, a lot of questions still to be answered. One question that I'm sure when people heard your original description, Eridanus, about savers and synthetic assets is, I'm sure there's this concern when people say, oh, wait a minute, you're taking my one Bitcoin and taking half of that and swapping it into Rune. Even though I'm not exposed to the Rune, it's getting deposited into the vault as half Rune, half Bitcoin. So therefore, one might ask, if Rune price drops even 10, 15%, how is the vault able to burn the synthetic and create a whole Bitcoin when half of that has already been sold for Rune? I'm sure that's a big question people have. What's kind of the solution that THORChain's implement to make sure that people can still retain that full mainnet one Bitcoin when they want to withdraw?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's basically two mechanisms that kind of help the user out in this situation. There's arbitrage bots that are always kind of active in these pools, and then there's the slippage calculation. So just to be clear about like the redeemable quality of the synthetic asset. So we say that one synthetic Bitcoin is always redeemable for its counterpart, its L1 counterpart. But again, just to reiterate, the redeeming, the minting and burning is a swap through the THORChain L1 pool. And every swap will incur a slippage fee. So if you had one synthetic Bitcoin, you might get 0.998 L1 Bitcoin, because that's the slippage cost of swapping that amount of Bitcoin. So that's something that is always in play. If someone were to deposit one L1 native Bitcoin into the Savers Vault, and then there was drastic price movements of Rune relative to Bitcoin, and pool movements basically occurred. So they will face that same slippage calculation on the way out. So if that pool became way more shallow, they might be getting out 0.995, 0.990, and that might kind of decrease as that pool gets very, very shallow. So that's that slippage calculation that will happen. And the other thing I'll say is that when you're backed by, as you mentioned, 50% of that L1 pool or L1 asset and 50% of Rune, well, how can I get my L1 asset back out? Is that when that swap happens, that's an imbalance of the pool that basically occurs. And so you can assume that if you take like one L1 Bitcoin out, well, now you've basically made Bitcoin cheaper on THORChain. You basically taken that asset out, and so you can expect that an arbitrage bot will come in and kind of recorrect that price, kind of top back up that Bitcoin, that native L1 Bitcoin in the pool, so to speak. So that's kind of a constant mechanism for, as these savers redeem, the arbitrage bots are kind of dumping more L1 Bitcoin back into the pool to rebalance the pricing, and that slippage calculation will kind of affect exactly how much you'll get redeemed.
So what would you say is what's a critical point, right? We like to talk about the risks of these protocols and savers. For someone that's depositing, say they see this APR, it's about 5% on Bitcoin, all right? So one thing I'll be transparent and let people know about is that there are slippage fees going in and out. And we've kind of analyzed our UX and Eridanus. I know we've talked about this. Right now, we show people the total fees incurred when people deposit into savers. What we don't show people is what are the fees for when they withdraw, and because that's kind of an estimate. It depends on the pool depth at the time that they withdraw and whatnot. But we could probably improve the UX to kind of estimate it as of right now. But for now, there are fees to deposit. Once you deposit, you don't get the full one Bitcoin. You get something less than that that's deposited, and when you withdraw, something comes out. So someone's expecting this 5% yield, and say they've held it in their out over a year, they'll probably have a little bit less than 5%. If everything's steady state, because they've got the slippage fees. What would be the critical point where someone now is seeing, let's just say, less than, like, they're actually losing, say, 10% of their deposit, what would have to happen? And I think that would be a critical point. Like if someone deposited 1 Bitcoin, they're getting 0.9 out of the system. What would have had to have happened to the system for someone to experience that after like a year of having their funds deposited? What would be the price of Rune? I know usually the price of Rune is what people ask, but what kind of weird occurrence would have had to occur?
One thing I want to mention though is that like one of the unique aspects of THORChain's AMM model is that in the end the user gets to dictate or pick what they want to pay in fees, right? And so if you have a large Bitcoin position in the savers pool and in withdrawing would cause I'll just call it 10%, slippage fee to it, then you can break that up and withdraw 2 times or withdraw in pieces, five different transactions, and by doing so you're actually going to pay less in fees in total. So the more you actually withdraw in pieces, like if you did 10 it would be even less. If you did 30 withdrawals instead of 1 withdrawal, it would be even less you'd pay in fees. So in all cases and scenarios, the user has the ability to choose how much they want to pay in fees, and they can do that just by making smaller and smaller trades and making many of them rather than just one larger trade or one larger withdrawal or one large add to the savers position. So but to answer your question of like if what would have to happen if something would cost like a 10% fee on the way out, you'd have to have the Bitcoin pool become significantly less in depth, and the amount of Bitcoin you're pulling out would have to be a relatively very large quantity.
And would that be independent at all of the price of Rune? Like if the price of Rune relative to Bitcoin dropped 90%, to a tenth of its value, and the depth still be kind of the same, right? Exactly the same depth. People maybe deposited more Rune for liquidity, making sure that the depth is still the same, but someone not be able to withdraw their full one Bitcoin deposited. Like what would cause them to lose 10% other than slippage in depth? Because the depth can be fixed, but the price of Rune not, right? Say the price of Rune does drop. Is there any risk there?
If the price of Rune drops significantly, right? Let's say it drops 90% to your scenario, that would inherently cause the pool depth to become more shallow, right? Because what would happen is the value of the Rune would be worth a lot less, which means there's too much Bitcoin in the pool and not enough Rune. So an arbitrage bot would throw in more Rune and take out Bitcoin. And the act of doing so would probably cause the total depth of the pool to decrease in some amount, right?
So it would, although it would, but that's in a static situation where someone doesn't come in and to go and deposit more liquidity to make it equal to the point when I had deposited my savers in the beginning. So say you had $1 million worth of Bitcoin, $1 million worth of Rune, right? And of course, those are just dollars. The prices of each asset could change. And now the amount of Rune drops. So instead of there being $1 million worth of Rune, it's now, $100,000 worth of Rune. Now, someone can still come in, and now the entire pool depth is only 1.1 million versus 2 million at the time. Well, someone can go and deposit more liquidity and bring the entire pool back up to 2 million. But the price of Rune is still a tenth of its price. So now you don't have the slippage concern. So the slippage is not the concern anymore. It's just simply the price of Rune. Is there a situation where that could cause someone to have the inability to pull out funds? And this is an honest question. I don't actually know the answer to this. So
yeah. So one of the interesting. So let's put it this way. Let's go to some extreme scenarios where Rune's price just like dives by 90% or some crazy number, while the rest of the market is staying constant.
Yeah.
So the synths themselves, the savers themselves, are backed by the value of the pool, right? And so if the Rune dives by 90%, we're just kind of adding more liquidity and removing arbitrage from just to make this simpler to think about. And the pool drops, the new Rune drops by 9%. So the Rune side drops by 90% in that Bitcoin pool. And so then the value, hypothetically, it's possible that the value of the pool itself is worth less than the purchasing power of the synthetics or the savers, right? Let's imagine that case and scenario happens. Okay. Now you could argue in that moment that we're quote unquote insolvent, right? In the sense that there's not enough value backing the value of the synthetic assets, right? The network itself doesn't actually adhere to this in some sense. The network itself is still, if you withdraw your synth at that time, you don't get part of your synth back. You get the full synth back, your full layer one asset back, minus whatever the slippage fees would be at that given moment in time. Like, it doesn't actually start saying, oh, well, you know, the pool only has 90% of the value that it needs, you know, so you'll get 90% of your synthetic value back, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't actually behave like that in that scenario, right? So you still get back, and then eventually, hypothetically in this scenario, somebody who was like the last saver to leave would be the one that's kind of holding the bag, and there wouldn't be enough value, and the slippage fees would be so high at that point that they would, you know, they wouldn't get back much of their position, just because the slippage would be so massive. Because as everybody's leaving, all the savers are leaving, blah blah blah, that could cause the depth to go smaller and smaller and smaller. But this is where, like, this is why we have the POL, right? This is the purpose of the POL, is to protect from this scenario, right?
What's a POL? Let's describe that. I don't think we've covered that too much yet.
Yeah. So the POL is short for protocol and liquidity, which is conceptually a little bit similar to what we heard from like the Ohm days and other kind of like DeFi 2.0 things we heard about like a year ago. You know, very different in terms of how it's structured and how it works, but it's just the idea, in a simple perspective, it's the idea that the network itself has this thing called the reserve, which is approximately like, I think 160, 170 million room, which is, I don't know, like something like 40% of the supply or some number of Rune itself. And it has access to this liquidity, which is right now it's primarily just used for block rewards. It's just kind of like dead capital, just kind of sitting there and then secreting each block for block rewards. And so the protocol liquidity is just the ability that the protocol itself can take some of that Rune from that reserve, which is, you know, a whole lot of Rune. 170 million Rune is like more than all of the bond and all the pools combined, then multiplied by like 2 or 3 or something like this. It has the ability to deploy that Rune into the pool, right? So if the situation happens where the synth value is worth more than the value of the pool, the protocol and liquidity say, well, let's support the pool, let's support the synths, let's support the savers, make sure they're whole. And so it'll just start deploying Rune into the pool and keep on doing so until the value of the pool is greater than basically the value of the synths themselves. That's one way to think about it. So the protocol itself ensures not just from the value of the pool itself that it has enough value to support the savers, but it also includes a value of the savers of the reserve itself. So all in all, you're talking about you know, let's say approximately 200 million Rune that is backing whatever the value of all the synths of the network.
Got it. Is the amount of protocol liquidity factored into how much the total set of vaults can grow to? Meaning that, hey, we got to make sure we have enough protocol owned liquidity that can back these vaults should the price of Rune drop. Is that something that's factored in, or the protocol owned liquidity is just kind of wherever it's at, and you know, you kind of hope it's enough?
The protocol itself basically looks at the synth utilization of the pool, right? So it's looking at like how much of the pool is the synths like kind of taking up, and for the most part that'll be like 30% or 50% or something like that. And so if it's above at the POL number, let's just call it 50% for argument's sake, then the POL will start deploying more Rune until the synth utilization drops back down to 50%. So if the Bitcoin price rises by 10% and the synth utilization grows just from the Bitcoin price change from 50% to, let's just call it 60%, some number, the protocol would start deploying Rune in the pool until the sync utilization drops back down to 50% again, right? So the network just has all of that Rune available to it to deploy. It probably will never actually need anywhere remotely close to all of it, just because this network is bounded. It's not like, you know, a CeFi platform like, you know, like BlockFi, where there's just no upper bounds to the amount of Bitcoin that they can take in, more or less, right? And they just adjust their interest rates. The amount of savers that can come in is bounded by the pools, and the amount of that can come in from the pools is bounded by the bond, right? And so, and the reserve is orders of magnitude much larger than the value of the bond. So, like, got it. Because there is a direct relational cap to these things, to manage risk, to manage, you know, these kind of risks that we're talking about, it makes me feel a lot more comfortable about it. If we just kind of like did what most of DeFi does and just kind of arbitrarily says, well, everybody can YOLO in and whatever happens, and like, you know, like most protocols do this, where they don't kind of manage risk. They just say like whatever, people can just jump in as much as they want to all day. That would be problematic, because at some point, if THORChain was very successful and like everybody puts all their Bitcoin in, then the reserve would no longer wouldn't be viable to be able to support in the event the runes price dives by 40% or some percentage or whatever. So you need to be able to cap that risk. That's why Savers has a cap. That's why all these things are caps. It's like we can't just arbitrarily allow people to come in all day. We have caps to what we think the protocol is safe to be able to respond to.
Got it. And so I want to try to make a quick analogy to CeFi. We're up in the hour point. If you guys have any hard stops, let me know. But an analogy to CeFi. Let's take BlockFi as an example. You mentioned, hey, they just let no cap. Everyone deposit as much Bitcoin as you want. Blah blah blah. The protocol owned liquidity. One could take the analogy of saying like that's BlockFi's own money, right? Not customer funds, right? It's their own money, but they as a company could deploy their own capital if they wanted to protect consumers, right? To protect the users of their platform, because in a way BlockFi earns money whenever people use the product. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned this, Eridanus, on a previous call. Protocol-owned liquidity actually grows when people use the platform through some of the fees. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand that?
It's a regular liquidity provider on THORChain. So just like we said before, so whenever a swap happens, it earns a little bit of rune. Yep. Got it.
So it's just like another actor that's earning on THORChain. And it's like the large kind of liquidity provider. Great. So it's earning, and so that in and of itself is growing, just like BlockFi would earn on the fees when people go and trade or deposit, whatnot. So that's growing. Now it then could deploy that as a backup. The difference being that BlockFi might have 100 million in their own bank account, but they will let people deposit 10 billion into the system. Whereas THORChain is saying that, okay, well, we'd rather have 10 billion, in the system and let people deposit 100 million. Smaller amounts are inside of the active user deposit liquidity than what the kind of protocol or company in a CeFi equivalent would own, because that's your backstop. And that's kind of where the curve is kind of inverted in the sense with THORChain versus CeFi.
Right.
They have more to back it up.
In addition to that, like when you give your money to a BlockFi, you don't really know what's happening with it. You don't know. They talk about, and you don't know if they put it into FTX or not and lost it all. Blah blah blah. Like you have no idea what's happening, right? And you don't even know how solvent they are. You have no idea how close they are to having a problem. And the benefit of THORChain is just like at least you have complete clarity about what's happening and how much and what's backing what and what the state of things are. Like, and I can't hide that information even if I wanted to, right? Or anybody for that matter. Yeah. And so like, at least in this situation where if things start going south, right, for some reason or cause, say runes price is diving and people get nervous about that, they can just go ahead and withdraw their assets. And that's fine, right? And by doing so, you're actually helping the protocol because we have less outstanding, Bitcoin to support in a sense. Do you see what I mean? And so like there's a natural tendency that even if things start to go south, the natural tendency of people starting to withdraw their synths or withdraw their savers or withdraw their Bitcoin or whatever would just make the network more safe effectively, just by reducing the actual liability.
So that's an interesting model, is the sense that a run on the bank actually helps the bank, which is the exact opposite of the CeFi model.
Yeah, right. Let me try and help break down protocol owned liquidity a little bit more simply. So protocol owned liquidity, its goal is to maintain a synth utilization percentage. So like the pool, the pool is composed of these liquidity providers. It has Rune and it has Bitcoin in this example, and a synthetic asset, you could think of that as a debt to the pool. So that debt, it's accounted in terms of liquidity units. So it's this like arbitrary number. You put one Bitcoin in, you might get 10,000 liquidity units. And the protocol automatically knows, hey, we have 100 synthetic Bitcoin issued out. They're all in savers. And we need to put aside 100,000 liquidity units to make sure that there's always enough Bitcoin left for the synthetic asset holders. So the THORChain protocol itself is always making sure that there's enough liquidity left aside for the synthetic asset holders. And what the protocol owned liquidity does is if that utilization goes above a certain percent, above, let's say we target it at 45% of the pool or 50% of the pool, if the synthetic asset utilization starts growing above that, as in there is more savers debt than whatever the targeted percent is, 50%, then the protocol owned liquidity starts entering in that liquidity, and that will drop the utilization of the pool. So it protects liquidity providers in that way by basically putting a ceiling on the total amount of debt that the pool can have. So the pool won't grow to have 100. If the pool was like 100% utilized by savers, that means the entire pool is in debt to the savers. Like
Right.
all the liquidity is necessary in order to be able to cash out all the savers at once. So the protocol owned liquidity enters to keep the synth utilization low, to keep the other liquidity providers safe. And that's basically the everything all together, like how savers, liquidity providers, and POL all work together, and it keeps the system safe, but it lets it grow as well. So
what I'm gathering from this is it really seems like a lot of the risk, which is what the first thing you had mentioned, Eridanus, which is a lot of the risk really gets put onto the standard dual asset LP providers. And that's what keeps the savers kind of safer. Once again, there's no 100% risk free. There's always protocol risk as well, bugs in the app. But as far as like the economics and the economic risk, a lot of it is pushed to the regular liquidity providers, of which one of those is the protocol owned liquidity, which is kind of like your largest liquidity provider that comes in to kind of keep things in check, making sure that I think right now it's at 30%. So 30%. No more than 30% is savers. So that way you have enough of the 70% incurring enough risk to make sure that the savers can be made whole. Is that a good kind of summary of where risk kind of lies and what's able to make this user experience kind of very seamless for the savers and the trade-offs at play?
Yeah, I think you can think about it like the dual LPs kind of have a leveraged LP position, whereas the savers have, this kind of protection of being backed by the liquidity units of the dual side LPs. So, liquidity providers on the dual sides mechanism are basically, they're more subject to the price movement relative of Rune to the L1 asset, and they're leveraged in both directions. If the Rune price is going down, they might be, earning less value over time, and if the Rune price is going up, well, now they're earning more, and so they have this leveraged like yield position essentially. And that's the risk that the LPers have, and that's why they kind of earn more of the yield, right? They earn some of the yield that the savers should be getting based on the liquidity that they provide. So that's a kind of a good way to summarize it.
Right.
Got it.
The amount of leverage that the LPs take on is relative to the amount of synths in the network, right? Or amount of savers. Mm-hmm. So the higher quantity of savers, the more leverage basically the dual side LPs are basically taking. So we've gone from 15% to 30% in the last couple weeks or so, and so they're taking on a greater leverage Rune position. So if Rune price outperforms asset, they do very well, and then the other reverse is true, right? So that's just part of what people should be aware of and be conscious of when they're providing liquidity in one form or another. If that's too risky for you, then just become a saver, right? And if you want more risk, more reward, then be in a dual side LP. Like, it just depends on the risk profile of the individual, how they want to be exposed.
This is
and talking about the other end of that, but let's say Rune outperforms and does really well. Less liquidity units need to be portioned off to the savers when.
Right.
So if Rune outperforms, you don't need to give them 100,000 liquidity units anymore. You can give them 80,000 liquidity units. So that all that extra that was before given to the savers, as in like liquidity units that's set aside to back the savers, if when Rune outperforms, then all of a sudden they have 20,000 more liquidity units for the LPs. So that's why you see that leveraged effect where the LP really outperforms when Rune does, and when Rune underperforms, the LPs are the ones that take that hit for the savers. So it totally different risk profiles for a different type of user, and it all works like really nicely together, I think.
And I think people, especially those that aren't traders or not Wall Street degens and whatnot, forget that for those of us that just kind of want something safe and stable, there is someone else on the opposite side of the system that is the degen that's helping us give that stability, right? Like if you think about like commodity markets and buying pig's feet, and in Chicago Mercantile Exchange, a lot of these farmers, they want to have like stability and being able to sell their product at a set price over the course of 5 years. Guess what? There's someone on the opposite side of that that's saying, well, I'm going to take a bet against it, right? And degen and take a leveraged position where I get great returns if prices go up or down and short. And we might criticize those people as the degens of the world, like, doing crazy gambling, but that's actually what provides some stability for the rest of us. And so this is kind of how economics works. And this is exactly what you guys are mirroring in savers versus standard dual asset LPers is you take your risk profile. Neither is the wrong answer. It's just depending on what's your threshold for risk and also what's your desire for a return. We get the term like, this is crypto. I don't wake up for anything less than 10x. Well, great. That's, then you go down that path. And then for the people that are like, a standard savings account, I can't even get 1% on my savings account. Well, great. Take that money and put it into something in crypto and get 2, 3, 4, 5%. You're already getting something, maybe a tiny bit riskier, but far less than going into dual asset LP with impermanent loss risk and multiple asset risk. So I get it. It fits exactly how our system works currently, a TradFi system, but once again, with a huge benefit of pure transparency, auditability, censorship resistance, accessibility to everyone anywhere in the world. That's what makes me super excited about this. I know we're way over in time, but if anyone has any questions, no one's come up and raised their hand other than Maverick. Although I know that at least on Twitter when we announced the space, we had a boatload of questions. Maybe you guys have already answered it for people because we went into a lot of detail. But I just want to remind people, like, feel free if you guys do have a question, or raise up a hand emoji, and we'll bring you up on stage.
Looks like we
to fire it off.
Looks like we had one question in the chat here.
Okay.
Said, it sounds like a risk of what happened to Luna and FTX, backing up the protocol by a reserve of a token. How am I wrong?
Okay. So in Luna's case, what they did is that they had a secondary asset, UST, for example, that was backed by the Luna price and had the ability to mint whatever quantity of Luna that was minted to be able to redistribute value to that person holding the UST who's like burning the UST to acquire Luna to kind of exit their position. And there was no bounds on that. There was no they created what I would call a top heavy system, where they created a secondary asset where they had 20% fixed rate, which was a ludicrous concept by itself. It was not sustainable.
Yeah.
It was I wouldn't say it was a Ponzi scheme per se. I don't think it's probably not fair, but it's just like giving away the cow for free in interest to get as many people in the door as possible, which created a very top heavy system where the UST was worth a lot of money, more than the Luna market cap was at the time, if I'm not mistaken. And then as soon as you created a panic for the door, everybody holding Luna would panic and would exit, which causes massive hyperinflation scenario. There's no opportunity for hyperinflation or even inflation at all in this context. So there's no there is some price reflexivity in the sense that, like, if the POL needs to deploy some Rune to further support the savers, the act of doing so does create some sell pressure on the Rune asset, for example. But to compare that to USD Terra is, a far-fetched and dare I say even ridiculous kind of notion, because in the context of like the death spiral that was Terra Luna, the only time you get death spirals is when there's a pressure to take an action, and then you take it when the action actually increases the pressure, right? So there's pressure for people to dump Luna, and the action of dumping it creates more pressure than there was previously. Most of the time we see spirals in crypto, happens all the time. Almost even Bitcoin itself has spiral aspects to it, but most of the time they're not death spirals, meaning they spiral out. They usually spiral inward until they get to center and then stop. And so this is more so much the former rather than or the latter rather than the former, of it spirals inward to the point and then it stops. Which that happens like in every system across the crypto industry. Every asset is exposed to that concept in one form or another. It's a very commonplace thing. So it's pretty far fetched in my opinion to make a connection between Terra and Savers.
And Savers doesn't mint any coins out of thin air at all. It's so right. When people make swaps, coins get deposited into those liquidity pools, and those become liquidity units. And like what I just said earlier, synths are just liquidity unit. It's just another way to account liquidity units in the pools. So these aren't tokens being minted out of thin air. This is just liquidity that's being entered into the pools. Whenever someone makes a swap, there's just a little bit of dust gets left behind, and that's what grows the liquidity in the pool, and that's what grows the saver position, and that's why the synth that you might deposit into savers, that's how that grows over time. It's from the liquidity actually growing in the pool. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, no, this is perfect. And I think there's one thing that people forget as far as the difference between Luna and THORChain and savers is that Luna had one purpose, which is to back USD. It didn't really have a utility that would get people to want to hold and use it. And I remember we, in a previous call, Eridanus, we talked about like, okay, well, where is the utility in Rune? And it has fundamental utility that gives it a baseline of value. All of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but the validators need to stake a certain amount of bond of Rune in order to participate in the network and earn a lot of the protocol fees. As well, it is the main asset that is used in all of the pairs, right? In all the vault pairs. And so it's not, it's not purely just we're going to go ahead and mint synthetics and back it with Rune. Rune also has, in and of itself, a core need, a financial need within the ecosystem, which helps stabilize its own value and price. In addition to a lot of the mechanisms and limits that THORChain's imparting to make sure you don't go upside down. So nothing's perfect. There are chances, but fundamentally, I think there's more stop gaps in place that keep the price, stable and keep the redeemability of the synths there.
Absolutely.
Well, cool.
Not to mention the whole over-collateralized nature of THORChain itself, where like THORChain is obviously this. I mean, it's been designed from the ground up as this over-collateralized system where nodes put up more than they actually hold. So it's quite interesting. Like we don't have to get into that now, obviously, because we have someone up on stage, Kim. But I mean, the whole system is designed for this security of Rune and accruing value towards Rune to secure the network, and that's why it's the most scalable way to go across chain because of the Rune asset itself. So,
cool, Kim.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up question to that. Great spaces, by the way, guys. On top of that, let's assume, forgetting the utility part, natural outflows of capital from DeFi. What happens if, there's general sell pressure and this asset goes down in value? How does the ecosystem still maintain stability with the fluctuation in the heavy sell pressure?
You're talking about if the Rune price dives, how does the system handle that scenario?
Yeah, because it's like a reserve token, right? It's back in all these different components. How does that work?
Yeah. Okay. So as we were talking about before, there's basically two things that back the value of the synths. And so one is the value of the pool, which is half Bitcoin and half Rune. And so it's in some sense like backed half by Bitcoin and half by Rune. And then in addition to that, it's also backed by the reserve, which is I think it's like 35% of the circulating supply of Rune itself. So in the event that if the Rune price were to dive by some amount, whatever the hell that amount that is, the network would hopefully have enough value to back the value of those synths from the pool value as well as the reserve value. And keep in mind that the pool value also includes the value that people deposited to begin with. So in order to get to that place where it gets really problematic, is not so much that the change in price value has been significant enough to overwhelm the value of the pool itself, along with basically a large percentage of the value of the entire market cap of the asset.
Okay, so basically, both in the worst case scenario, both Bitcoin and Rune would have to be going extremely down to really affect the ecosystem.
If Bitcoin is going down with Rune, then it wouldn't matter at all, right? It's only a matter when the change. If Bitcoin's going up for some reason and Rune's going down for some reason, whatever reason that might be, then that's where you could run into problems. But you would need to see I have to do the math, but with a 30% centralization, it's probably something close to a 60x price change, right, or something like this, which is pretty nutty. But it would be some crazy high amount price changed. And so the more synths that are in the network, the risk of the scenario that you're talking about increases, right? And so that's just part of the discussion or debate of like, well, if we leave synths the way that it is, we've capped synths, and savers is as big as it's more or less going to get until Root's price increases, or we increase the synth cap and allow more people to join in and cause the Bitcoin the Bitcoin pool to get deeper or whatever, and provide more value to the community. And that's just kind of the trade-off that we have to make as a community.
Got it. Makes sense.
And that trade-off right now is once again at that 30% line. So only 30% of the vaults can be savers, and so you have kind of 70% of its value, in addition to 50% of the savers, which are in true L1 asset, is effectively backing the synths.
Right. So right now, in order to get to a place where the pool is worth less money than the current synths of let's just call it 30%, you would need to see, I think it's like a 15 or 16x price change from where we are now. And then you would also have to start burning through, approximately 170-ish million Rune after that point, which would be, another, I can't even do the math on my top of my head, but it would be a gargantuan change in prices.
And that's 15 or 16x against Bitcoin or Ethereum
against Bitcoin, correct?
Or whatnot.
Right.
That's not against USD. Yeah.
Not against the dollar. It's 16x against whatever asset you could deposit via savers, which right now are all L1 assets. There's no stable coins that you can deposit in savers.
And not to mention that, you have to remember that Bitcoin's price and Rune's price are directly correlational. And I mean that in a direct way. Whenever there's Bitcoin buy pressure, say Bitcoin's price goes up by 5%, let's just say, that inherently means that the Bitcoin in the network is worth 5% more than the Rune is, which means that some arbitrage bot is going to come by, buy up a bunch of Rune, create buy pressure in the Rune asset to trade out, put Rune into the pool to get that Bitcoin that just increased by 5%. And so whenever there's buy pressure of the Bitcoin asset, there's direct buy pressure of the Rune asset. Whenever there's sell pressure on the Bitcoin price, there's sell pressure on the Rune price. Those things are directly correlational. And how correlational they are is directly relational to how many Bitcoin exist in the pool, right? And so the deeper the pool gets, the more correlation there is between the Bitcoin price and the Rune price. And if there's more correlation to the prices, the less likely, the more difficult it is for Rune's price to dive, 90x down versus Bitcoin's price going up, 30x up or whatever the hell it is. It de-risks itself in some sense, because as the pool gets deeper, it becomes more increasingly difficult for the Rune price to deviate from correlating with the Bitcoin price. You see what I mean?
Right.
Yep.
And relatively speaking, most cryptocurrencies trend with each other, with a few exceptions. And Rune seems to trend. Obviously the smaller cap coins will be more volatile. They'll trend to go higher up during bull markets and further down during bear markets, but they'll tend to trend with each other. So one of the challenges with Luna is that you had the risk of a crypto asset and its price relative to a stable asset, with the dollar, which the two completely don't trend with each other, obviously. Whereas here you're not dependent on Rune going down, you're dependent on it going down relative to the deposited L1 assets such as Bitcoin.
Yep. Got it. Clear. Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks, guys.
No problem. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. Do we have anyone else here?
There is one more question in the chat, and I'll just ask it right here. So it says, thank you for addressing half the question, but the other half was about comparison to something like FTX. The exchange was backed by its token, which went to zero once people lost confidence in it. So, they want some kind of answer about. So, what happens with Rune and FTX? Is there a comparison there? What do you think, Chad?
So the problem with FTT, right? And so that was used as basically to collateralize. They would give the Bitcoin that they got from people, and they would give it to Alameda to make, let's just say, highly risky, trades. And then they would basically back that BTC price with their own token, the FTT token, And so there's a lot of problems with this. One is nobody knew this was happening, which is obviously a problem. But the other thing is that they didn't really have any way of capping it, right? That the amount of risk they were taking on was not relational to the value of the FTT they were holding or anything like this. They didn't even let people know they were even doing this, like in the slightest form or stretch of imagination. And then all they're required to kind of like unravel this whole box was Binance holding, I think it was about like how many millions or billions of dollars worth of it, like some huge, massive amount, because they were one of the original investors of FTX. And so they had this massive amount of FTT. And then CZ just basically tweeted saying, oh, we're going to unload this, like, you know, crazy high quantity, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, of FTT onto the market, which caused everybody holding FTT to be like, whoa, okay, if they're going to sell $1 billion of FTT onto the market, now's a good time to get out because the market's going to crash. So before they could even sell like a single FTT token, the market went from $27 or $26 per token down to, like, you know, I think like $3 or $4, something like this, like almost like, you know, within hours or something like this. The nice thing is that, like, nobody in the space, not myself or anybody else for that matter, has enough Rune token to even make that threat, to be honest with you. Thankfully so. But also, like, the thing is that it's not backed purely by the FTT token, or in our case, the Rune token. It's backed primarily by the Bitcoin asset itself. And so there's for a large quantity of that Bitcoin, and arguably, if we do a 50% utilization, for example, everything is backed 50-50, you know, at the time of that pool. So, like, yeah, does that make sense? Am I making sense here, or am I not making sense?
Yeah, it seems like, in the fact that we're not 100% backing any of these synths with a more volatile asset than the actual L1 asset itself. So it's already starting off with a 50% backing. And so in a way, if you think about it, that's the worst you can get is 50% if Rune went to absolute zero. All right, correct me if
So
I'm
the
wrong.
savers always
like
have redeemability because they're always taking away from the LP share. It's the LPs that have the risk of if Rune underperforms, they're the ones that are left holding the bag. The savers can always redeem their assets because just the amount of units just increases as the Rune price decreases. So the liability on the regular LPs increases, but the synth holders aren't left holding the bag ever.
Yeah, there's actually one simple calculation to know is savers at 30% of the liquidity is half Bitcoin and half Rune. However, 70% of the liquidity in the pool is full Bitcoin as well, which could then be used to back up the 30%. Right. So you've already got 70% that can be put into backing, you know, the savers Bitcoin, even if Rune went to zero. You still have that other Bitcoin in the 70% of the pool. And that's like the simple math to say that, hey, you'll always have enough Bitcoin to back the savers in the absolute worst case.
In the case where, like, say the synths increased to 50%, right? That means that the quantity of synths in the network will be effectively equal to the quantity of Bitcoin in the network.
Exactly.
Right.
Even at 50%. So 30%, you have more quantity of Bitcoin in the network than you have in synths. At 50%, you have exactly that amount. But then that's discarding the fact that Rune still has some value to back it up. But I think that's the key math right there that should answer anyone's concern, is that there's always going to be more than enough Bitcoin in the network due to this ratio of synth in the pool versus pure LP liquidity.
Well, I don't want to say that, just because if, say, there's 50% synth utilization, and then, say, you know, some big whale of an LP decides to leave, right? As the POL would deploy it back in to put it back up to 50%. So, like, that's what it's there for. But, like, just say the POL doesn't exist yet, then you can get a situation where there's, you know, little Bitcoin in the network than synthetics. And so I want to be very clear and transparent. I'm trying to be very, like, you know, honest with people about the risks at play, and so that everybody's aware of what they're doing, and they're informed to make an informed choice of what they want to do with themselves, or they like this feature or don't like this feature or what have you. But there is, because the pool is 50% Bitcoin, 50% Rune, and there's 50% synth utilization. In a sense, that effectively means that there's a one-to-one relationship between those two things at that time. But that's not enforced. It's not like a wrapped asset where, you know, that Bitcoin is locked and not going anywhere until those people, savers, or leave, blah, blah, blah. It's not a wrapped asset. And so you really have to keep that in mind. Wrapped assets are inherently highly flawed, and we shouldn't be using them at all, in my opinion. But there are other mechanisms in which cases that Bitcoin in the network could leave, in the sense of either LPs leave, or swapping, or well, even swapping is not so much, because if somebody does swap, the Bitcoin comes back in through arbitrage. But if price changes in Bitcoin and price changes in Room can cause more or less Bitcoin to exist in the network.
Right. Understood.
Yeah.
Well, cool. All right, we're a good 90 minutes into the space. This has been an amazing discussion. Thanks so much, guys. I think let's end with, at least, I'm sure people may have more questions or upcoming questions after they try out the feature. Definitely do please give it a try. It's available right now in Edge. Should be pretty simple to use. Unfortunately, it's a tiny bit hidden, so tap on the stake button in any of the supported assets: Bitcoin, AVAX, ETH, BCH, Doge, Litecoin. Give it a try. But where can people get in contact with you guys should they have some additional questions? I know you've got multiple channels: Discord, Twitter, whatnot. Feel free to share.
Yeah, Discord and Twitter is great. Go ahead, Eridanus.
No, I was just gonna say, we have a dev Discord for all the THORChain contributors are there. You can feel free to tag us on Twitter. We're always open to having these public conversations. Obviously, we're it's a transparent protocol, and we want all the risks to be transparent. So, yeah, Twitter or Discord work.
Yep. If you click on the THORChain profile and obviously follow THORChain, because that's where all the latest news and hot takes are. But if you go to the link tree and the THORChain profile, or any of the sites, even, you can get a lot of info. The link tree, I maintain that, and it has just a bunch of great links for everything related to THORChain, every interface, guides, information, and just connect with the community. Everyone's on Discord and Twitter, and all the links are in the link tree, so you can find us here, and we're always around. We do these spaces every single Friday, basically, at 12 Eastern, so anyone can tune into these. We'll be on this Friday talking with some interesting people just about THORChain. We do this really often, so we love doing this with you guys. Hopefully, maybe we could do this again in January, or make this more of a reoccurring thing. It's our second one with Edge, so these are always a bunch of fun. And you guys, we really share a lot of values with Edge, and just a rockstar team to work with. So it's a lot of love from this side.
Awesome, a lot of love on our side as well. Independent of the virtual space, I'm big on Meet Space. Any in-person events you guys are going to be attending anytime in the near future, where people can actually see you and chat in person and realize there's real people behind this, not just an icon on a Twitter Spaces.
I'm DYORing right now with conferences to go to. If you have any suggestions, we'd love to get some opinions on where people want to see THORChain this year, because we're definitely looking into what kind of events to go to this year. So we'll be out in the Meet Space.
Yeah,
well.
I think we'll be out at Quantum in Miami at the end of January.
Awesome.
But yeah,
perfect.
So I think we'll be there. Chad, I don't know if you have any other appearances coming up, but yeah, again, as FamiliarCow mentioned, we're always down to come talk.
I have some people trying to pull me into ETH Denver and to show up there, so that may or may not happen. I'm still trying to talk to my wife to happen. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Big event.
Yeah,
yeah, for sure. That's the one that I'd love to be going to. So perfect. Quantum Miami, I'll be there as well. A few of us on the Edge team will be at Quantum Miami. It's one of the longest running conferences since 2014 in the Bitcoin space. Just got rebranded from TNABC to Quantum Miami. Hope to see you there, Eridanus. I think you'll likely be on stage talking about THORChain, which is awesome. Share with everyone else, and then probably ETH Denver. But great. Anyway, thanks a lot for everyone chiming in. Go ahead.
Let me just give a final thought for people to ponder on, and for after having this kind of long conversation, is that the savers concept that we've been talking about is a first in crypto history, right? Nobody's ever produced a system like this before, and it pretty much in a system that was usually dominated by C5, BlockFis, and those similar services, where now I guess they're all dead because of poor practices. But you can't build and expand what this industry does without having some kind of risk involved in the system. You can't produce anything that produces yield without having some risks involved in the system. That's just like an inarguable thing. And so there are risks with this system for sure. And I think we've been trying to be very clear and transparent about what those risks are, so people are informed to make the best choices for themselves. But this is something that I think is desperately needed by the industry, and it is totally worth the energy and effort to actually produce and build and to see how it performs in the real world. I hope people can learn more about it, ask questions on Twitter or Discord or whatever, and kind of get more involved if you want to. But this is something that the industry's been dying for years, and most people thought were literally impossible, and there's no reasonable way to getting native yield on Bitcoin, for example. And I think we've finally accomplished something that that for most people thought was impossible or impractical.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that recap. And you're right. The industry has not just been dying for it. People have been dying because we didn't have it, is what it feels like. And so hopefully we can avoid some of those financial deaths going forward. And so once again, you know how to get in touch with everybody. Edge.app, at THORChain handle, 9 realms. Yeah. Open, transparent. We're here. We're building. Excited to bring this kind of future into the decentralized world. So thanks a lot, guys. And we'll do this again. Take care.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Paul.
No problem. Bye-bye.